In today's business world, change is the only constant, and mastering transformation is the ultimate key to success. Welcome to Shift and Thrive. I'm your host, Natalie Nathanson. Each week, we'll bring you conversations with CEOs who delve into how they successfully drove critical change in their organization. This show is sponsored by Magnitude Consulting, bringing you the thinking power of a growth consultancy and the getting it done power of a full-service B2B marketing agency. I am super excited to introduce today's guest. He's spent over 15 years in the recruiting and talent management space, holding key positions across both the in-house side and within recruiting firms. He is a powerhouse in the world of robotics. He's been named by LinkedIn as a top voice in the robotics space, and he's the host of the Machine Minds podcast, which is dedicated to having deep dive conversations with executives and other innovators about the dynamic world of robotics and artificial intelligence. He's the founder and CEO of Samson Rose, a boutique search firm specializing in robotics, AI, and hard tech. Greg Toroosian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for the intro and for having me on here today, Natalie. I'm blushing. Such a good intro.
All very well deserved, Greg.
Thank you.
I'm very glad to have the conversation with you today. And, I think to start us off, given your expertise in the talent and recruiting space, I think you'll have some unique perspectives here. And so I wanted to start by asking you, what would you say is the biggest misconception out there about driving major change or planning for major growth in an organization?
Yeah, it's a big question. Obviously, my bias is always going to be towards hiring and growing organizations in that respect. So I think from a misconception standpoint, or probably a misstep as well, that a lot of people do, initially when you start building a company, you're going to speak to and bring on people in your own network, whether you're co-founder or leaders that whatever it is. And that's fine for like the initial steps of hiring and growing and even getting you past some initial milestones. But once you start really scaling, really starting to grow, incorporating other avenues of talent, other networks of people, and even help like someone like a Samson Rose to help you tap into talent pools that you don't have access to or people you're not aware of is going to be so important. And your investors are going to want to see it. It's also going to be valuable for your product and for your company in the long term, because it's diversity in a number of different ways, diverse talent pools, diverse thoughts, diverse backgrounds, instead of hiring everyone from a similar network, one or two networks. It's toxic isn't the word that I want to say, but it can be detrimental is what I want to say. And then also, as your company grows, you're going to look to, I call it shedding staff. So the people that have got you from your founding or your inception to maybe your Series A funding round, when you're going to B, C, D rounds, or you're going to go from like an R&D shop into something that's more commercial, you're going to shed staff. The same person that led your engineering or led your ops to get you from 0 to 1 isn't going to be the same person to take you from 1 to 50. So being conscious about that, being intentional about that, and being ahead of that curve instead of when it becomes a problem, trying to address it, is usually when I see companies being the most successful.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear from you. Like, how do you know when you've outgrown someone? I haven't heard the term kind of shedding staff, but I have had other conversations around that even if an employee is fantastic and maybe was one of the most kind of pivotal people in the organization, when you go from kind of 0 to 5 or 0 to 10 employees, but kind of the what got you here won't get you there kind of mindset.
Yeah.
So do you have any advice that you give on how to know when you've outgrown someone?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's two things here. It makes me think about another area that before I jump into individuals, also for founders and CEOs or whatever the leader might be, you might be a CTO, knowing when you're a bottleneck is also going to be crucial and key for growth. So you might, especially at an early stage startups, when you hire people to do multiple jobs. It's just the nature of it, right? You come in, maybe you're a small, lean team. People need to do more than what their quote unquote job description says or job title says. And that includes the founders, right? But it gets to a point where you need to relinquish control, hire experts in certain areas. Maybe you're juggling sales, marketing, and engineering, right? Or you're trying to fundraise and run the facility and operations. Know when you need to hire an expert in that. And some of that is self-awareness. And that's not everyone has that, especially first-time founders, especially early in your career, or if you haven't been in this situation before. Listen to your team and know when things are taking longer than they should. So that's one area. And that ties into with individuals as well. When you're going to, and we'll just take operations for an example, because I love hiring like COOs or heads of ops because it's different everywhere, you know? But in some places, your operational person would be the right hand to the CEO. They take care of everything else in the business apart from customers and fundraising, or they're just everything behind the scenes and not the face of the business. Knowing when you need to get that person in place is key. But then also sometimes in ops, it might just be someone who's taking care of your facilities, right? But when you get up to a certain point where now you're like multiple locations, or you're international, or now you're raising capital from different types of VCs, trying to get people who have had experience with that is going to be very, very helpful for a number of reasons. One, the success of getting that job done, but then two, for investors that are looking at your team and saying like, oh, well, you actually attracted heavyweight people. You've attracted people that have, proven success in the past. They're good data points. But then also getting your talent to be attracted to come and join that organization. Because when they see someone who is, I'm saying operations, but it could be finance, right? If they see a CFO or a head of finance who has done, they've fundraised with top tier VCs, or they've taken a company public, or, whatever it may be, they've worked internationally. As a FP&A person or an accounting person, you're probably going to be more drawn to work under a leader like that instead of reporting to a head of ops underneath when you're in finance. So being mindful about that, being aware of that is going to be key. And there was another point that I wanted to make on that you don't have to, when I say shed stuff, you don't have to let people go. It's being upfront with a conversation and just talking about, titles are very free in startups. Sometimes you'll bring someone in and you'll be like, hey, you're head of ops, but that's catch-all. Now that person might become director of ops and you're going to hire a COO, right? Have that conversation, retain that talent, because you don't want to lose all of that institutional knowledge. You want to still maintain your culture in some respects, and you want to take care of people, not just show them that once you hit a certain point, you're out. Some people might want to leave, they just love that 0 to 1 build. And if you've ever worked in a startup, it's addictive. You go to look for the next thing. But giving them the opportunity and trying to retain them is going to be important as well.
Yeah. I actually just saw that happening with the client where they had someone who was, really strong, but, had kind of outgrown the role that they were in. And the CEO was very kind of open and transparent about it, and ended up ultimately was a win-win situation where that person got kind of great title, individual contributor role instead of the manager of what was now a pretty large team. But had actually a bigger role in that they were a new face of the company and in the thought leadership and things like that. And I think that person was frankly sounded a bit relieved, to not be kind of stuck in the role that they didn't necessarily sign up for in those earlier days.
It's a good point, because if you have the chat, some people just say yes or take on the extra responsibilities because they've grown with you, but maybe they never wanted to be a manager. Maybe they never wanted to be a head of department, right? And they've just fallen into it because they've been with a company for so long and it seemed like the natural thing to do. But if you give them the opportunity and then you get to save that person, retain them, you'd be surprised. You'd be so surprised that some people don't want to be in the role that they're in, but they do it for the betterment of the company or that situation, that time.
Right. It can feel like a daunting conversation to have, but then, like you said, it can really surprise you.
Right.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more on the founder side, because that's a dynamic that I see of when has the founder outgrown their role and they need to bring in, a new CEO or whatnot. And I'm curious if you see it more kind of the founder has that self-awareness, or more of kind of investors or the board is telling the founder. What are you experiencing there?
A great question. CEO as well, especially in the startup world, can be a catch-all title. The only one that I see that's not really a catch-all title is the CTO, right? Or chief product officer or whatever it may be, because they're very technology focused. If you're a CEO or a COO, you can be doing almost one and the same things. But the CEO tends to be, especially at an early stage, the founder. And some people just aspire to be that. Right or wrong, it's a passion, it's a purpose, it's like their baby that they've created, whatever it is. And that's fine. But knowing what your job description is, especially as you grow, at first it's everything. Like I said, you wear all the hats and that's just how it is. But as you grow, as the company becomes a bit more mature, as you maybe start getting customers, as you start getting more external stakeholders, they can be customers, they can be investors, they can be, partners. Identifying key roles, duties, responsibilities, and who's accountable for what is going to be super important. And that's going to help you know when you need the help, right? Because the most successful CEOs that I've worked with realize like, hey, I am the vision for this company. I speak to our customers initially, and I raise capital. So I also do interviews and I do, I'm the face of the business, but everything else I just can't be on a day-to-day basis. I'm involved with, but I can't do it. And whether they have a co-founder who is more operational or more technical is ideal. But then you just have to look at like, where are the holes? If you're a lot of the times, especially in my world, the founders are CEO and CTO, co-founders, right? It hits a breaking point operationally where, like if we're both doing our jobs effectively, we cannot still be in the weeds with all the operational stuff. We'll get reports in, we're in these meetings, we get like the Cliff Note versions, give me the bullet points, but they can't on a day-to-day do that. And that goes for like marketing as well, finance as well, sales, like not always like that grunt work. Or a lot of it can be strategic and visionary work that you just need an expert for.
Right.
You're definitely going to be a legal expert as well as being a technical expert, as well as knowing how to market. So the most aware people know that. And some of the times it's painful to get to that process, because if you're a first-time founder, you just don't know. And a lot of people go into it with their eye. I don't want to say you just don't know what you don't know, right? Until you're in the position. So especially if you're a first-time founder, you take for granted sometimes what being an employee means for you. You can just focus on your one area, and whoever runs the business and all these other departments that are enabling you to be successful in your individual role, you don't have them anymore. So now you have to go through the pain to realize like, wow, people do juggle a ton in the background so I can be successful in my vertical. So now you have to implement that. But to your other point, or your other question about knowing when to replace yourself as CEO, I don't see that as often, whether people are like, I want to keep the CEO title and maybe I'll hire a COO who does everything else I used to do and I'm just going to do this one part, or they hire a president of the company. That's normally what happens. Or the board pushes it. That's a little bit more painful sometimes. Like it's a more tough conversations. Obviously things have had to happen. Cracks have started to show, and maybe they end up repositioning the CEO as, hey, you're just going to be the CTO, or you're going to be a board member or an advisor or a president yourself, and we need a CEO. And you tend to see that later on when the company is hitting new stages of growth or milestones, or they're going public or whatever it is. Because if a lot of money's in there, if there's a lot on the line, there wants to be, or the board and investors want to see more of a guarantee of someone that can take it to that step. And if you've already shown the cracks, they're going to protect their investment. And you should as well, really, as a CEO. The pride should be put aside, and what's right for the business. Can you be in a different role, more effective? Or is it time for you to go and do the next thing and still be an advisor and a board member? They're all options.
Right. Well, and you talked about, right, like this is the CEO and founder's baby. And so that can be hard to let go of, but just like your kids, right? Sometimes you need outside tutoring. Sometimes you need to kind of let your kids get to go out the door. So I think, and be on their own. And so I think the analogy can carry on, and it can be hard to let go, but ideally it does come from that place of self-awareness, as you were talking about.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's exactly like that. It's tough to do it and, entrust someone else with what you've built or the child that you've raised or whatever, however you want to look at it. But what's best for them or that entity, that business, that team is sometimes a different leader. And,
Right. Right.
it's not always easy to get to that point, but it's definitely the big picture you have to look at.
Yeah.
Might have to
We
shed
talk-
yourself.
Right. Well, we talk about that, like even within an individual function, like within the marketing function, we'll talk about, right, the first person that you hire or the first big marketing investment that you make, that's someone who knows how to develop the strategy and look at the market and get all the foundations in place. That's not necessarily the same person and the same skill set as the person who's then kind of the operator who keeps it
Yeah,
moving and optimizes it, or the person who knows how to scale it up. So I think within each individual function, there's kind of the components of kind of when you're done with that particular need and you're kind of moving to the next phase of your business.
100%. I think like marketing, because I mean, within recruiting, I've worked internal as well and helped build and lead those teams. But I see marketing, sometimes even legal and recruiting, all in the same boat because they're like an afterthought when people are building their companies, and sometimes like a cost center, right? Oh, it's just going to drain money or it's a necessary evil sometimes, and then they skimp on those first hires. So that's an ideal first hire that you said, like someone who's going to set up operationally and put in the structure and the infrastructure, etc. But sometimes people are like, well, I'm just going to get like a low level marketing person to come in and do some of the grunt work. And you miss that from the start. Same thing with recruiting, right? They're like, oh, we'll hire one person to come in and take care of HR and recruiting. And we've got 50 roles we want to hire this year. You're already like going in the wrong direction, especially if no one has set that up. Even simple as knowing what your budget is or which tools to implement or how to train the staff, or from a marketing standpoint, what inputs we need from the business so we can spit out what we need to do, what direction we want to go in. Like, if you haven't, if you don't know enough about that department or you haven't worked with a department like that beforehand, you're going to skimp and it's going to be painful. You might as
Yeah.
well invest, properly or outsource it.
Right. Right. Well, and I think most people learn that lesson the hard way, and that is back to
Definitely.
your point about when to bring in kind of that, seasoned CEO or whatnot. I find, the ones that have been in the bigger companies, or they know what good looks like and they know what they don't have currently. Those are the ones that are either surrounding themselves with kind of the people who've done it before, or understand kind of where the gaps are and how to fill that.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes it's as simple as just looking at numbers. If you're an early stage company, you're like, hey, we have 5 hires to make this year. Why would you hire a full-time recruiter or someone to lead that department when you can probably tap into your network and then outsource a few roles? The same thing with marketing. You might have certain level of awareness or speaking engagements or whatever that, incoming interest that you need to hit in the first year. Outsource it to someone who's like a good company that that you can grow with. And then when you get to the point where you need to hire a full-time person in marketing or PR or a full-time recruiter, then bring them in. But you look at the numbers, and to bring on a headcount or a heavyweight marketing person, a heavyweight recruiting person who's probably going to need another resource underneath them, it's a lot. Just outsource it. It's going to cost you less in the first year and less commitment, and then also less attrition if you don't need them going past that first year. Just bite the bullet, and a seasoned or aware CEO or leader will know that stuff. Like, hey, it doesn't make sense to hire someone. Let's just outsource it, delegate that, and let's focus on what we need to focus on internally.
Right, right. Definitely agree with you there. I want to shift gears a bit, and another topic that I'd love your insights on, given kind of your experience with kind of talent management. And we talked about this a little bit in a previous conversation, but just how much is changing in the way that people work. And I think there was, right, the COVID era, immediately post COVID, and now we're in this kind of new normal, at least in my view. And I think it's interesting to see how different companies will respond and have adapted to that. So I'm curious, what changes have you seen on both kind of the employer and employee side as far as expectations around kind of working in office, remote, hybrid? Would love to get
Yeah.
your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hot topic, right? Because recently Amazon just kind of mandated everyone back in the office. And it's a really tough shift because from that COVID era of when people were, or companies were more open to remote staff and travel in occasionally if you need to, your talent pool is completely opened. I have a neighbor, I live in Southern California, who works in Amazon, but for HQ only has to go in periodically. That's going increasing a lot more. And that's a strain on an individual who has a family, etc. Like, you have to take all of that stuff into consideration. So if you're a company that is now enforcing that and pushing that back, you have to kind of expect that there's going to be attrition, right? People are just going to look for local companies if everyone's going to push to go back in office, or a hybrid situation. But no one's going to say, okay, well, I'm going to travel 4 hours, there and back twice a week or whatever it is, or once a week just to hit this quota. It doesn't make sense. The companies that are still offering fully remote, I tend to see are just more either software or service driven. I do a lot in the hardware space, and that has always had an in-person need. If you're working on robots, if you're working on something in manufacturing, if you're working in a logistics facility, you have to be there. There's no way around it for the most part. So hybrid is kind of now the new normal. I'm speaking to some startups now that are like, hey, we want people in, or the ability to be in 5 days a week. Maybe we'll do 1 day remote. And they're a software company. I'm like, well, look, you want high level talent. You're competing with everyone else. You're not paying as good. No one really knows you. And now you're putting in this extra hurdle for people to overcome. Like, be aware, oh, we've got a flat org, so there's no title. So you don't have a title, you don't pay as well. Now you want people in the office 5 days a week and no one knows you. And there's more risk for an early stage startup, like in people's minds anyway. It's being aware of who you're trying to hire, or even in the case of trying to bring people back into the office, who you're trying to retain, and what the market is offering, or what their other options are, is going to be super important for companies if they want to be, still be an attractive employer. Unfortunately, for individuals, it's very much a client-driven market right now. During, post the COVID furlough era, it was a candidate-driven market because everyone opened it up remote. Candidates could kind of have a pick of where they wanted to be. There were all these incentives to hire, et cetera, et cetera. So if you were working with a good candidate, they could choose where they wanted to go. Now it's the other way around. So there's a lot of people looking and there's less roles. So an employer can enforce that stuff, but the writing's on the wall. When things change, and they will change, whether it's in like 6 months, 8 months, whenever it is, back to more of a candidate-driven market, all those people that are in a disgruntled situation of getting forced to go back into the office are going to leave. There's no two ways about it. If you've got another opportunity where you can be more flexible, you can be at home, people are going to opt for that. But yeah, companies, I think, need to have some flexibility there, and also the awareness, and different types of perks. If you are an in-office environment, know that that's going to only appeal to certain types of people, certain stages of career. By that, I also mean, like I mentioned, I'm in Southern California. I'm in Orange County. But when I moved from the UK, I was in LA. It was a very different time in my life. And I loved it. And I wanted to be in the office and all of that stuff. But the reality is that when people hit a certain stage, they're going to move more probably to the suburbs, or some people are going to move different states where their spouse is from, wherever it is. So now if you're trying to attract talent that is at that upper stage of their career, more senior leadership, etc., knowing that they're probably not going to be living in downtown LA or Santa Monica or wherever it is, and they're going to be further afield, having a hybrid situation is going to be key, or a satellite office. And that goes for any major city, right? Whether you're in New York, Boston, San Francisco, whatever, asking people to commute 1.5 hours, 2 hours each way is a big ask, especially if they've got a family, and you're just cutting down their productivity time in the office, because they'll be like, okay, well, can I come in late and leave early, or vice versa? So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think, I have a few personal friends that have left roles because the dynamic shifted from, what they signed up for. And I think your point about the profile of employee that you need and thinking
Yeah,
about what is likely going on in their world. Are they older so they don't have to worry about kind of kids at home? Do they have a family and they want to make sure they can see their kids off to the bus? And I think seeing that productivity can actually go up with that remote environment, but then also needing to make sure that from a cultural perspective, you're still able to have that kind of team cohesion, even when you
mm,
are remote. And then to your point, in your field, the things that have to be in person because of just the way the company is set up.
100%. I mean, I'm again biased because I'm in the people business, right? So being in person or getting FaceTime or seeing an office, a facility, a product is important for what I do. Some people's roles aren't. Some might just be more field based, right? And this is a conversation I have with clients a lot. Like, for example, if I'm trying to help them hire someone with their marketing or sales and like we need them in office, my first question is why, you know, and is it full time? And how do you want this person to build their org? Because if you have a sales org in the hardware world that is all in office, would you not want them to be field based, for example? Because they're going to be going out to client sites, they're going to be regional, and they want to know those regions. Or marketing, why are they in the office? Can they come in occasionally, get that? Or they're more, same with recruiting, but there's more in person there. But aren't those performance based roles? And or are they not like a product based role that they're going to just spit out the product? Do they need to be there, or can they be there more like once every fortnight, occasionally, etc.? And people need to start thinking through those things because it's going to help you as a business as well attract the right talent. It's going to reduce your overheads. You don't need as big of an office space, etc. But what I find is the either less aware the leader, the founder is about other people's stages of life or situations or the big picture of those departments, you tend to get those roadblocks. And I've been guilty of it myself, right? Years ago when I was like much younger, earlier in my career, and hiring people, I'm like, well, why can you not be there? Or when you first start working with people that have children, you're like, they're hardly ever in the office, but you don't realize like they're working till midnight anyway after they're doing all this other stuff with their kids. So, being flexible and being accommodating to that, you're going to attract or be more in the mix to attract the right talent.
Right, right. Very well said. We've certainly had our own experience with that. And in years past, I think used to think, the size of my company's office presence as kind of a measure or proxy of the company's growth, success, and definitely had lots of changes of heart over the years and seeing can attract like really great people to the team that appreciate the flexibility that don't live, half an hour down the street from me. We call our setup local-ish, where the team is within a few hour drive of one another so that we can still have that in-person time and face-to-face interactions and collaboration, but not needing to only hire within kind of a 30-mile radius of where we put a physical office.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, like I said, the in-person element is still important. Camaraderie, culture, brainstorming, or even if it's just social, getting together every month or 2 months for a company social, whatever it is, reinforces the bond and all of that stuff makes it more of like a real place to be and work, and you have your own ties to it. You want to still establish that with a company, but being there every single day isn't feasible for most people.
Right, right. Yeah, well, thank you for sharing all your perspectives on that. You clearly come into this right every day and are in all these discussions. I wanted to turn the table a bit, Greg, and kind of look at your own business, right? As a leader and business owner in a rapidly changing field, wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about, what you're seeing in the industry, and then kind of what are you focused on in the business based on kind of what's happening in kind of the external environment.
Well, that's loaded. That's a
It,
question.
it sure is.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot, so I operate in the robotics, AI, hard tech space, as you mentioned. So I see a lot of technology and a, as someone who tries to be more efficient with their time and then also their processes and just what I can do more with less, or do more with less time or with ease. Trying to incorporate AI in what I do is a goal. It's not always the easiest. And I'm still not a huge believer that AI replaces a lot of, especially within recruiting. There's so much human element of that, and understanding. I probably need to put more time into seeing how I can refine what I do with that. But that's kind of like a goal of what I, on a day-to-day basis, try to do, augment what I do, look at technology and how it can best help me, whether that is keeping in touch with my clients, sourcing candidates, or even just setting up conversations, days, outreach, stuff like that. And the other part of your question is, what am I seeing in the market?
Yeah. What are you seeing in the space that's changing? How is that impacting things?
So apart from the working setup of people coming in and etc., I'm seeing across the board, and it's been like this for a little while now. And I probably think this is going to continue, but using that phrase again, trying to do more with less. And that goes from a hiring standpoint. So customers or clients that are hiring, whereas, maybe before they were hiring 10 people for a department, now they might have a headcount of like 3 or 4. So they're being a lot more targeted and specific about who they hire, why, the cost of that, and the profile. Whereas before you might be like, oh, and you just put it into your department that, hey, I need this headcount for next year, and it gets approved and it's easy to hire, and you just hire a bunch of junior people and you hire some senior people and you throw the salaries all around. And now it's like, do you really need that? There's a lot more pushback with planning, headcount planning, which is a good thing, because before you have these overinflate. I mean, it's not in my interest to say it's a good thing, because obviously I help hire, but I look at the long term, and if a company is going to spend 10 times what they need to in a department, it's just a shorter runway for the company. Then they're going to also have more attrition, most likely, just by default. More people are going to leave, but then also you're going to have, because it's an inflated department, people aren't going to be working as efficiently, right? You either have people that are coasting, or you have people that are subpar, or you have people that are like carrying so much of the weight because they've got 10 people and they're the only real ones that are doing stuff. They get disengaged. So I think it's a good thing. And I help clients a lot with that, right? When I work with first-time founders or CTOs, I say first-time founders. The only reason I say that is sometimes they know what they need, but they don't know like in the right order. But that can be any founder, or that can be any head of department, where they think like, hey, these are the hires I have for this year. Can we go out and get them all now? Or people tell me like, we want to hire 10 people in the next 4 months. I'm like, can you even onboard 10 people in 4 months? Like, you don't have 10 people in your company right now. As much as I'd want to do that, like, let's think about it a bit more strategically, again, more mindfully, and then talk about the process and what is the right role to hire at the right time, because all of your milestones, all of your goals aren't front loaded in a year. You have to hit XYZ before you need this person to even come in and be effective. So sometimes hiring too early is detrimental. That goes to like opportunistic hiring, or hiring people that are on your roadmap but too early, because they can come in and not have anything to do, or they're doing low level work that they kind of didn't think that they were hired for. Again, they get disengaged, they look elsewhere, etc. So with the more quality hire or intentional hire, it raises the bar on what we do as a partner, because you really have to do a thorough intake with your client and understand their motivations for this hire, the candidate profile in a bit more detail, because that goes more into like personality and stage in their career and what they're driven by, whether it's an impactful, purpose-driven, mission-driven company and product. Do they align to that? Or is it just like they're just driven to succeed, and you could put them in whatever role or whatever company? This is like building that persona of the person, but then also what success looks like in the role. And when you have these conversations with the company, a hiring manager, it helps them think through who they're hiring and why. And most of the time when we do this intake process, we call it our requisition lucidity process, you end up tweaking a job description, or the client, the hiring manager, the founder thinks through it in different ways. Like, oh, actually, I didn't think I needed this skill set. Or they've got this laundry list of stuff. They're like, actually, that isn't even relevant because this person's not going to be doing it for 18 months. But it'd be a nice to have. I'm like, is it nice to have? Because in 18 months, it's a different company. If you hit your hiring goals, if you hit these milestones, you might get another round of funding. You don't need this person to do that. You can hire someone else to do that in a different capacity. And this person can focus on that. They're like, oh, I didn't think about it that way. So it just highlights more of the service that we provide, more of the conversations, more that initial setup to know that you're going to go into this role to search for someone in the right way and then provide value to the client.
Right, right. I think that's so helpful to get that kind of expertise and thinking going in, and I think bringing it back to what you mentioned earlier, as far as right doing more with less. I think some of the kind of parameters that you gave around that, like it doesn't always have a negative connotation. Like it can be
Yeah.
okay to do more with less, and bringing it back to the AI part of the discussion. How do you train your team? How do you enable them to drive more efficiencies for themselves so that they aren't working longer, right? Maybe they're working harder, maybe they're working
Yeah.
smarter, but I think there's different ways of looking at that. And, we're seeing that on the marketing side as well. I think every function of the organization is going to be impacted maybe a bit differently than others, but that's kind of the challenge and the opportunity ahead of us.
I bet. And I have conversations with companies in AI and robotics all the time, obviously by the nature of my work and my podcast. But I always ask the question about, people have fears and the public have like that perception that AI or robots are going to take over our jobs, right? And when you actually have the conversation and talk about and ask the poignant questions, most of the robotics that are being built right now or being implemented in industries are for industries and spaces that have a huge deficit. They don't have enough staff. They don't have enough people there to do those jobs. So they're bringing robots in to do jobs that people aren't doing right now, or to help them in these dull, dirty, and dangerous jobs where humans shouldn't really be doing. And on the AI side, it's not replacing, it's enabling you as an individual to do more or be more efficient or be more effective. You just have to use it the right way, because I don't think AI right now, in a lot of instances, is in a place to take over like a marketing function, a recruiting function, a sales function. It's just not. You need human, call it human in the loop, Hill. So you need a human in that loop to take over or to direct it or to, guide it or take that input. And, you ask ChatGPT to write you whatever it is you want to write. You're not just going to copy and paste that and use it. You still need to go and edit it and put your own flair on it and stuff like that. So helping your team be more efficient, do more with less, be more productive. That's what AI is going to help with.
Yeah, yeah. And I like what you're saying about right, robotics building for kind of deficits in the workforce or the dangerous areas. It's not really a parameter that I've thought about in that way. I don't know if you have any client examples that come to mind of clients that are kind of applying it in those ways that you're able to talk about.
I'll talk about one because of the conversation I was having the other day with the CEO from Boardwalk Robotics. They're a humanoid company in like the logistics space. Well, there are multiple different functions, but let's just use logistics or manufacturing, whichever it might be. The CEO was telling me a story about he was walking through a facility with the leader of this facility, and he's like, looking at the team, do they always work at that capacity? Some people are just like hardly working, doing stuff. And his feedback was, he said, well, they know I am short 80 people, so they don't need to work hard. They just work because they know I can't fire them. I already have a deficit of 80 people and I need to keep this facility open and I need to get some stuff done. So they don't have to work at a high level to know that they're not going to get fired. But it's affecting the business because we still have overhead and we have deliverables and we're not able to reach those. Other ones are like, I'm trying to think of ones if I can name. There's various in like food tech, logistics tech, but then also agriculture tech. Those three areas where you don't have enough staff to do the manual labor. Because again, since COVID, a lot of people didn't go back to these kind of roles. And then some people have just like gone off to do other things. But that the perception is that, hey, robots going to take the jobs. But the reality is there are so many open roles that need to be filled and so much demand. Just think about logistics purely, the reliance we have on things like Amazon. Every single house in an area is getting tons of boxes every day. Where do they all come from? You know, even packaging those boxes together, there's so much automation in these logistics facilities, certain ones. Some don't even have that yet, right? But there's this huge burden on them to package things, send them out, things go to the right place. Then you deal with all these returns and stuff like that. There's not people there doing that 24/7, whereas a robot can do it with the lights off. Now you have these facilities running 24/7, whether they're manufacturing parts or food or packages or whatever it is. That's the element that these companies are providing a product for. And you are not expecting to hire like 1,000 people to work midnight to 7 a.m. doing that, but these robots can, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating. I think there's so much interesting happening in the space, and yet we're still so early. So we're going to see
Yeah.
a lot more of that. I'm curious, Greg, just to shift gears a little bit, and would love to hear about your background. Like, how did you end up in the field of robotics? Was there something that drew you in, or was it more kind of happenstance? Tell me a bit about kind of your background and how you got to where you are.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the recruiting space for over 15 years now. Um, like most people in recruiting, they'll tell you they just fell into it, which is kind of what happened with me back in the day. And I first worked for a recruiting agency in the UK. So I had an agency career, and then I moved to the US with a recruiting agency, a UK one that had an office in LA. After I was here for a while, I went internal and built my career that way. So I was part of HR teams in technology companies. The first company was an ad tech firm, and then I got headhunted to this company called Hyperloop. Well, at the time it was called Hyperloop Technologies, which was a Elon Musk idea, high-speed transportation, a pod levitating in a tube. The whole idea was to get from LA to San Francisco in 35 minutes, etc. LA to Vegas in like 2025. So I was very excited by that. So I was there for like 3 years, and that was my first introduction into hardware. And working with anyone that was closely associated to robotics. Because prior to that, all of my experience had been software or infrastructure, IT infrastructure, and networking. So you never really see what you're recruiting for, what the people you're recruiting for are building. There might be apps. You go to some cool offices, all of this stuff, tons of data and cool apps, and you see all of this stuff. But when I went to Hyperloop, now it was all physical. So we had like levitation chamber, we had like machine shops and all of this stuff. And it was, we had a test track. It was so cool. And because no one had built a Hyperloop before, we were bringing people in from all these different industries because it was a new form of transportation. It's a moonshot idea. No one had done it. So we were hiring people from robotics, people from aerospace, automotive, defense, you name it. I was working with people that had worked on the Mars rover and like all these PhDs, and it was just like so interesting, so cool. So many smart people. And then I had this overarching view of software engineering, hardware engineering, systems engineering, manufacturing and test engineering, all of it, right? And then the corporate side. So that was my first introduction to the hardware space and robotics in some way. Then I led talent acquisition. I was a director at Sweetgreen, which are a fast casual food chain, salad brand. But we were doing or looking into doing automation in the kitchens, so robotics for food prep. So now they have like a fully autonomous restaurant. But those are like my first introductions. And then when I started Samson Rose, one of my first clients was in the robotics space, and it just carried on from there. From an interest standpoint, it's hard not to be interested in robotics. I think if you anyone should be, or we've got sci-fi films everyone's been aware of and stuff like that. Even if you don't know the ins and outs of it, there's an interest level there. So once you start learning more and you realize the applications and you start talking to these companies and these founders and seeing their products and going to conferences, it just builds and builds and builds. And it's something that I'm very passionate about now and super interested in and enjoy working in.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. I mean, it's just fascinating to hear you talk about some of these examples and kind of reimagining transportation, reimagining kind of the dining experience, the restaurant experience. So I'm definitely with you there as far as the passion for what we see, what's possible.
Yeah, it's really eye-opening. And we'll see it more and more in our day-to-day lives at some point.
Yeah, I think the convergence of a lot of the different technologies where they are now is really going to catapult the industry forward. You're probably seeing a ton of that already.
Yeah, I speak, like I said, investors as well and founders, and everyone says the same thing. Right now, the convergence of the cost of technology reducing, the cost of hardware being reduced so much, and just the ability of a lot of this stuff. Everyone is aware of AI right now. It's a conversation 2 years ago you weren't going to be having with like your neighbor or your parents, but now you are. Everyone talks about it. Everyone's aware of what ChatGPT is. Um, and the ability of these systems, these tools, is mind blowing, and it is growing and changing so rapidly that it's a great time to develop a product, to develop a company in this space. And that just means that we're getting closer and closer to seeing it in our everyday lives.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So Greg, you work with a lot of leaders and have talked about some of the areas you advise them on. I'm now thinking about your own leadership and knowing what you know now and everything you've learned in your career over the years. What advice would you give your younger self in your first ever leadership role?
That's a good question. The advice I would give myself, ask more open questions to your team and be more open to learning from your team. And that can go for just their personal situations, right? Their interests, their goals, and how to incentivize people. Because everyone's different. Some people might be working with you out of convenience. Some people might be working with you because they want to take over one day, or they just want to learn the ropes. I really like working with people that have a passion outside of what we do. Recruiting is, I think, amazing. The industry that we work in is super cool, but it's nice that they have something else that what you do can help them achieve that, whether it's a hobby, whether it's traveling, whether it's whatever it is, sports, something that will enable them, they could be passionate for outside of work, but then you can also tie into their work. And just realizing those things, because everyone's different. Something like my podcast has helped me be aware of and help share with a lot of people is no one takes the same path, whether they're a CEO, founder, or an investor or whatever. No one has taken the same path, and there's no traditional way to go, and everyone's got different interests. So knowing what those are and how they can work with you and to the benefit of your company helps you connect with that person more, but then also support them better and then get the best out of them.
That is great advice. Thank you for sharing that. And before we wrap up, can you tell our listeners where they can find you, how they can reach you?
Of course, yeah. Very active on LinkedIn, Greg Toroosian. You can find me on there. Send me a connection request. My podcast, Machine Minds, is on all platforms. Choose whichever one is your favorite. Or our website, samsonrose.com. You can reach out on there as well, or just see open roles and things like that.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. That's great. And I will put a plug for your podcast. Just the conversations are so interesting and many very different from one another. So definitely recommend our listeners check that out.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on the show today, Natalie. This was great.
Yeah, really great to have you. And also, thank you for everyone that's listening. I know I loved hearing about so much that Greg shared from, how he looks at hiring through the different growth milestones, of an organization, the conversation about the different work environments and how to figure out what's right for you and what's right for you, at the different stages, the examples in robotics. So if today gave you, our listeners, any valuable insights, and I'm sure that it did, please share this episode with someone. Spreading this kind of knowledge and information really helps all of us grow as leaders and equips us to drive successful innovation and transformation in our organizations. So thanks again, Greg.
Thank you, Natalie.
And this has been another great episode of Shift and Thrive. See you all next time. That's a wrap for this week's episode. For show notes and more, visit shiftandthrivepodcast.com. A special thank you to our sponsor, Magnitude Consulting, bringing you the thinking power of a growth consultancy and the getting it done power of a full-service marketing agency to help B2B companies fuel their growth. For more information on Magnitude and to get your complimentary transformation readiness assessment, visit magnitudeconsulting.com/getready. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week.